Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be looking at how financial firms in the UK are working to combat financial crime.
Okay.
And our source material is a fascinating guidebook published by the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA.
Right.
It's almost like a secret playbook,
Yeah.
revealing not just the musts, but also the shoulds and the mays of preventing financial crimes.
Uh-huh.
We're talking about everything from money laundering and terrorist financing to fraud, data security, bribery, corruption, sanctions, and even insider dealing.
Yeah, it's quite comprehensive. And what's really intriguing is that it goes beyond the sort of legalistic, what you absolutely have to do.
Right.
And it gives you a real sense of the FCA's expectations and what they consider to be best practices.
It's like having a direct line into the minds of the regulators,
Yeah,
which is
exactly.
pretty cool.
Okay. Oh.
But before we get into the specifics of each crime, let's start with the foundation, the bedrock
Yeah.
systems and controls.
Absolutely.
It seems like that's where the FCA puts a lot of emphasis.
You're absolutely right. The guidebook is very clear that robust systems and controls are the bedrock of any firm's efforts to combat financial crime. And it all starts with the tone from the top.
Okay.
Senior management has to be actively involved, setting the example and ensuring accountability at all levels. They can't just delegate this and hope for the best.
So no more burying their heads in the sand,
Exactly.
hoping that financial crime just goes away.
Precisely. The FCA makes it very clear that this is not a one-time box-ticking exercise.
Right.
Risk assessment needs to be an ongoing process, constantly evaluating vulnerabilities and adapting to the changing landscape.
Makes sense. Criminals are always finding new ways to exploit weaknesses, so firms need to be just as agile in their response.
Absolutely.
What other elements does the FCA highlight in terms of building a really strong system?
Well, one key area is policies and procedures.
Okay.
These need to be comprehensive, up-to-date, and easily accessible to all staff. It's not enough to have them hidden away in a dusty manual somewhere. They need to be living documents that guide everyday operations.
That makes sense, but it also sounds like a huge undertaking, especially for larger firms.
It can be, but the guidebook emphasizes the importance of consistency and avoiding discrimination in these policies.
Right.
You can't have one set of rules for some customers and a different set for others. That's not only unfair, but it also creates loopholes that criminals can exploit.
I see. So it's not just about having policies, but about applying them fairly and consistently across the board.
Exactly.
What about the people, the staff who are actually interacting with customers and handling transactions?
Yeah.
They must play a critical role too, right?
Absolutely. The guidebook dives into the importance of staff recruitment vetting, ongoing training. It even mentions that remuneration structure should be considered.
Oh, interesting.
You don't want to incentivize risky behavior, right?
Definitely not. It sounds like they're
Yeah.
really trying to create a culture of compliance from the boardroom to the teller window. And it's not all just theory. They actually include real-world examples of good and poor practice to illustrate their points.
Yes, they do.
What are some of the examples that stood out to you?
Well, one good practice example involved a firm actively considering the impact of financial crime on its customers, not just its own bottom line.
Okay.
It's easy to get caught up in protecting the institution itself, but this firm went a step further and really thought about how their actions could prevent their customers from becoming victims.
It's great to hear.
Yeah, it shows a genuine commitment to protecting people, not just profits.
What about an example of what not to do?
One example that the FCA highlighted involved a firm that focused solely on meeting the bare minimum regulatory standards.
Okay.
They weren't really engaging with the spirit of the rules or thinking critically about the risks. It was a very classic tick box approach that ultimately left them vulnerable.
So the message is clear. You need to be proactive, not reactive,
Yeah.
and genuinely understand the risks and your responsibility to address them. Regular audits and compliance checks are essential to make sure that everything is working as intended, too.
Yeah, exactly. It's like building a house. You need a solid foundation of systems and controls before you can start adding the walls and the roof.
Okay, so we've established that having robust systems and controls is essential. Now let's get into the specifics of different types of financial crime, starting with something that might surprise our listener.
Okay.
Let's talk about money laundering.
Okay. When you think of money laundering, I bet you picture something like shady backroom deals, suitcases full of cash.
Yeah, definitely like something out of a movie.
But it's actually a lot more sophisticated than that, and that's what makes this guidebook so interesting. It breaks down money laundering into 3 stages:
Okay.
placement, layering, and integration.
Okay, I'm following.
So imagine criminals have all this dirty money from their illegal activities. The first step, placement, is all about getting that cash into the financial system.
Right. But I'm guessing it's not as simple as walking into a bank and making a big deposit.
Exactly. They have to be much sneakier than that. They might make a bunch of small deposits under the radar, or they might use seemingly legitimate businesses to mix the dirty money with clean funds.
So, like, what kind of businesses?
Think casinos, online gaming platforms, even art galleries.
Oh, wow. So they're basically trying to make it look like legitimate income.
Exactly. They're trying to fly under the radar. And then comes the next stage layering. This is where they try to obscure the trail of the money.
Okay. How do they do that?
Think complex transactions moving money between different accounts and shell companies, sometimes even across international borders. The goal is to create a web so tangled that it's practically impossible to trace the money back to its source.
Wow, that does sound pretty complicated.
It is. And then comes the final stage integration. This is where the now clean money is reintroduced back into the economy.
So how does that work?
It could be anything that makes the money look legit. Investments in property, legitimate businesses, even buying luxury goods.
So by that point, the dirty money has basically gone through a complete makeover.
Exactly. It's practically untraceable.
It's amazing and a little scary to think about how much of this could be happening without us knowing. So with all this complexity, how are financial firms trying to combat it?
Well, the guidebook highlights the role of the Money Laundering Reporting Officer, or MLRO. They're like the financial detectives within each firm.
Oh, okay, so they're the ones responsible for investigating suspicious activity.
Exactly. And they report anything they find to the National Crime Agency, the NCA.
So they're on the front lines looking for those red flags.
Absolutely. And one of their most important tools is customer due diligence, or CDD.
CDD, what's that?
It's basically knowing who you're dealing with, especially if there are any red flags, like if a customer is a politically exposed person or from a country with a high risk of financial crime.
So it's like a background check for your customers.
Exactly. You need to make sure you're not unknowingly helping criminals.
Right, that makes sense. And is there anything else helping in this fight against money laundering?
Technology is becoming increasingly important. Firms are using really sophisticated systems, even artificial intelligence, to monitor transactions and spot unusual patterns.
That's interesting.
For example, the FCA fined HSBC a whopping £63,946,800 for weaknesses in its transaction monitoring systems.
Oh, that's a lot of money.
It is. It sends a very clear message that they're serious about enforcing these rules, and it's not just a one-time check either. Firms need to constantly monitor activity and update their risk assessments.
So it's an ongoing battle.
It is. Criminals are always trying to find new ways to exploit the system, so firms need to stay one step ahead. Speaking of vulnerabilities, another area where criminals often target weaknesses is fraud.
Right, fraud. That's something that hits a little closer to home for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Fraud. It's a word that can make anyone feel uneasy. I mean, we've all heard those stories about people losing their life savings to elaborate scams. It can feel so personal and violating.
You're right. Fraud is a serious threat, and it can have a devastating impact on individuals and businesses alike. The guidebook dives into different types of fraud, from mortgage fraud, where people lie on applications to get bigger loans, to investment fraud, where scammers lure victims with promises of unrealistic returns.
It's amazing how creative these fraudsters can be, preying on people's hopes and dreams for a secure financial future. But it is comforting to know that the FCA is actively working to combat these crimes.
Definitely. The FCA is committed to tackling fraud head-on. The guidebook highlights some of their efforts, like the information from lenders and information from broker schemes. These encourage lenders and brokers to share information to help identify and stop fraudsters before they can cause more harm.
So it's all about collaboration and communication across the industry to prevent those loopholes from being exploited.
Exactly. And for individuals, they recommend SUFES, the UK's fraud prevention service. It's a great resource for staying informed about scams and protecting yourself. You can check your credit report, get alerts, and find advice on how to avoid becoming a victim.
That sounds incredibly useful for anyone who wants to be proactive about their financial security. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about data security. With all the news about data breaches and cyber attacks, it feels like our personal information is under constant threat.
You're right to be concerned. Data security is paramount. The guidebook really emphasizes this and talks about the need to protect customer data, not only from those external threats like hackers, but also from potential internal risks.
Internal risks, you mean employees?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes employees can be the weakest link. They might accidentally expose data, or in some cases even intentionally steal it.
It's not something you want to think about, but it's a reality firms have to address. So what are some of the ways they can mitigate that risk?
The guidebook talks a lot about the importance of strong encryption, especially when data is being transferred or stored outside the company's secure network. And they also highlight the importance of securely disposing of any devices that contain sensitive information.
Makes sense. But it sounds like it takes a lot of effort to get it right.
It does. And they even share a case study in the guidebook where rent caller identification procedures at Norwich Union Life led to £3.3 million in fraudulent policy surrenders.
Wow. So someone was able to impersonate customers and withdraw funds because the company didn't have adequate security measures.
Exactly. It just shows how even seemingly small oversights can have huge consequences.
It's a stark reminder that you can never be too careful when it comes to data security. Now, for those of us who aren't cybersecurity experts, are there any resources that can help us understand this complex landscape?
Yes, the guidebook recommends the Information Commissioner's Office, or ICO. They're the UK's independent authority for information rights, and they offer lots of guidance on data protection best practices.
Excellent tip. Now let's move on to a topic that might surprise some listeners, bribery and corruption. It often feels like something we only hear about in the context of shady international business deals, but the guidebook suggests it's a much broader issue.
You're right, bribery and corruption can happen anywhere. The guidebook discusses the UK Bribery Act 2010, and it emphasizes that firms need clear policies and procedures to prevent it, especially when dealing with third parties.
Third parties, like contractors and suppliers.
Exactly. It's crucial to remember that a firm can be held liable for the actions of its associates even if they didn't directly authorize the bribery.
So you can't just turn a blind eye and hope for the best due diligence is key.
Absolutely. Thorough due diligence, having strong training programs on ethical conduct, and ongoing monitoring are all essential to mitigate those risks.
Sounds like it takes a multifaceted approach. Okay, moving on to our last topic today, let's talk about sanctions and asset freezes. This feels especially relevant in the current global climate, with so much geopolitical uncertainty and economic sanctions being imposed on various countries and individuals.
You're spot on. Sanctions are a powerful tool that governments use, and complying with them is a critical part of preventing financial crime. The guidebook explains the role of the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, or OFSI, in enforcing UK sanctions.
So they're the ones who maintain the list of individuals and entities subject to financial restrictions.
Exactly. And firms need to have really robust screening systems to make sure they're not doing business with anyone on that list. Accidentally providing financial services to a sanctioned entity or individual could have serious consequences.
I imagine the penalties for non-compliance are quite steep.
They are. The guidebook actually highlights a case where the Royal Bank of Scotland was fined £5.6 million for deficiencies in its sanctions screening processes.
Wow, that's a hefty price to pay for not having adequate systems in place. It really underscores the importance of getting it right.
Absolutely. Complying with sanctions is not something firms can afford to take lightly.
This deep dive has been fascinating. I feel like I've gained a much deeper understanding of how complex financial crime is and the steps that are being taken to combat it. It's reassuring to know that there are so many dedicated people and robust systems working behind the scenes to protect our financial system.
It is a complex field, and it's constantly evolving as criminals come up with new tactics. But the FCA is clearly committed to staying ahead of the curve and working collaboratively to make our financial system safer and more transparent.
It's a great reminder that we all have a role to play in protecting ourselves and the financial system as a whole. Whether it's staying informed, being vigilant, or reporting anything suspicious, we can all contribute to a more secure financial future.
Well said. The more we understand about these issues, the better equipped we are to prevent them.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of financial crime. We hope you found it insightful. And remember to check out the resources we mentioned, like the FCA website, CFIS, and the ICO for more information. Stay safe out there.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.